Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Faffing with Friends. I'm joined by my co-hosts,
Ivaylo.
And Joe.
Amazing. There we go. Today, we will be tackling a fascinating, scary, spooky subject, and that is cryptids. Now, for those of you that don't know, cryptids are sort of like our modern mythological creatures. They're weird, spooky monsters or creatures or happenings that we have that have been recorded and that people will tell you about. Like, do we want to start with more local ones, boys, do you say? Like, talk about some of the ones in the UK that maybe people haven't heard of as often.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
I think one of the main things that we have to talk about first before we delve into it is that I'm very happy you mentioned the fact that they are inspired by myths and legends, because there is a very big overlap between some of the stuff that we discussed in our mythology episodes and stuff that we might discuss today. And it's a very fascinating subject, really, because it really shows the evolution of people's imagination and the way that we tell stories and the way we can create this whole other world of just pure mythological happenings. I just want to ask, like, are we going to say that we believe in some of them, or are we just going straight out? You know?
That's my first question to both of you.
Yeah.
What do you guys say personally? What about you, Ivaylo? Do you believe in some cryptids?
I would like to believe in some of those cryptids. Like, I feel like on a deeply, like, childlike idea of mine, I would like to think that maybe, yes, there is a monster in Loch Ness, even though the river's been scanned, like, 1,000 times and nothing's been found, or, like, there's a big giant monster roaming in the forest. But at the end of the day, probably not. Let's be honest here. Like, they're very amazing and they're very fantastical, but, you know, I don't think they exist. That's personally my idea.
What about you, Joe?
I think that the human imagination is a very powerful thing, so we could always convince ourselves that something that doesn't exist or is just a figment of someone else's imagination does exist. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about the things I thought I saw when I was a child, but no, I would say I don't believe in anything of that sort. I mean, I have camped out in forests at night because we went on camping and stuff, and I didn't feel any fear or anything. So if I can do that, probably I'm fine.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that there were probably wolves in those forests, so...
Well, yeah, but those are much less cryptid and much more
real
actual danger.
Much more will actually kill you.
Yeah, but personally, I mean, like Ivaylo said, I grew up on X-Files, and X-Files was a show that pretty much was 100% look at these cryptids that we're going to make into a TV series. And so I do have like a morbid fascination with a lot of them and a lot of the currently, you know, existing myths and lore around them. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm, you know, a big believer. I think some of them are more realistic than others in terms of possibility of them existing. Like we mentioned the Loch Ness Monster, you know, so we may as well start in the UK.
Yeah, classic.
The Loch Ness Monster has been cited for like, since the 6th, I think, century. So it clearly is a result of the fascination that Celts had with sea monsters. If you look through Celtic mythology, there was a lot to do with, you know, sea monsters, and the sea was a dangerous place, and there were always spirits around the shorelines. So yeah, I feel like the Loch Ness Monster is, we see a modern evolution into the modern day belief of what the Celts used to deal with. There was even, I forget the name of the saint himself, but there is a story of a saint that went there to the Celts and apparently scared off the Loch Ness Monster with a cross. So as we see, you know, history, legends, they all melded over time into what we now have as the modern Loch Ness Monster.
Indeed, and I absolutely agree with the fact that it is absolutely human-made and human-inspired, and people can absolutely insert their agendas and their beliefs into the cryptids. One of the most infamous situations with the Loch Ness Monster is, I believe it's called the surgeon's photograph, where the guy, it's the most famous, it's the most well-known Nazi picture.
Yeah, it's the shot everyone's seen.
It's the most famous Nessie picture, and it's just like, it's meant to be obviously the neck of the monster right above water, but it's in reality like a tree branch, or some people have suggested that it was actually, in a more bizarre theory, it's actually an elephant trunk. So there's been all kinds of legends with it, man. It's just so fascinating. But yeah, I think Nessie is like the poster child of UK cryptids, and we certainly have a lot.
Yeah.
Like, people underestimate how many how many cryptids we actually have in the UK. And one of the main ones which are actually native to Scotland, and one of my favorite stories, is that of the Kelpie.
Oh, before we go to the Kelpie, I wanted to say who the saint was who warded off Loch Ness monster.
So Joe knows this.
Well, I know this because I'm a knight of Saint Columba, and the saint who did this was Saint Columba. So if I did not know this, I would be a very bad knight, and I would be a very bad Catholic. So so it was Saint Columba who warded off little Nessie, and I think it's just one of those things. You know, you get stories like this. Saint Patrick, which was Saint Patrick's Day a few days ago, warded off the snakes in Ireland, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. But yeah, it's a little interesting little tidbit. But it tells you something, doesn't it? That you have faith on one hand, and you have faith in the sort of pagan faith in these creatures. That Christianity is trying to say, well, that's not the same as what we're preaching, and we can easily, dispel these myths, if you like. But little tidbit. Sorry, Ivaylo.
I actually want to continue on that idea. You mentioned something very fascinating. I wanted to ask, do you see stuff like Nessie and cryptids as being akin to paganism, or do you see them as being more than like creatures of the devil? Like, for example,
can I take this?
Yeah. Go for it.
I feel like in the UK especially, they are a lot more pagan, spiritual, devil sort of things we have as cryptids. I feel like in the US you see this a lot less, and there's a lot less of the the supernatural in the term of like the devil or whatever. And here we have a lot of spiritual, like spirits. The Kelpie, like we mentioned, the Loch Ness monster even at that time was not really a dinosaur the way we see it visualized now. A lot of ours seem to be a lot more based on the pagan beliefs that were here before Christianity arrived and how they evolved over time.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of sources, that's definitely absolutely the case. They were based on pagan sources. But in terms of, if you're asking me on a religious basis, Ivaylo, then anything that's not good or holy is not from God. So even though it exists in the world, right? Yeah. So from perhaps a Christian point of view, giving respect to these cryptids, then they're probably of the devil's work and not God's.
Yeah, because we've seen many iterations of, for example, Nessie is like one of the most popular ones in cinema and stuff. How they're always presented as not being quite evil, but also being just like kind of like benevolent and just kind of just wanting to be left alone. Like if I think of Nessie, I don't think of a devil spawn trying to eat people, but it probably will. Like, let's be honest, it probably will. But yeah, just it's a very nice contrast of like what media has done with cryptids and Nessie in comparison to what the actual source was. But
now, Ivaylo, you are going to proceed talking about the Kelpie.
I was going to talk about the Kelpie. I absolutely love the Kelpie. It's one of my favorite legends. It is a legend native to Scotland, and it is that of a spirit mount, I believe. The Kelpie is known to hang around swamps and rivers, and it's almost like a challenge in some stories. The Kelpie, if you try to ride the Kelpie will take you down to a watery grave and kill you. But if you manage to actually withstand the trial of the Kelpie, you can actually take it as a mount for yourself. So again, it's pretty awesome.
I believe that the way you are supposed to defeat or capture a Kelpie is by grabbing hold of its bridle.
Yeah.
And there is a legend that one of the castles in Scotland was built with the help of a captured Kelpie, who then cursed the builder of the castle after it left to never have children, and their line died out, which is a very fun, fascinating. It probably came about because the lower class, peasants at the time, would look at this almost impossible to, fathom built castle in the mountains and be like, they couldn't possibly have done that through just man-made work. That has to be of some sort of supernatural result.
Right, the same way you get the History Channel claiming that the pyramids were built by aliens.
Yeah, ancient aliens. Very fun.
It's always a nice reference to go back to. It's always a nice reference.
But yeah, I love the Kelpie. It's very fascinating, and I think there's a Kelpie like story associated with every body of water in Scotland.
Yes,
I think
there's absolutely,
which is just incredible because it means this is such a well spread, well known, universal like cryptid / myth there. It's very interesting. And one of the things I like about the story goes that you can tell a Kelpie apart from an actual horse because the hooves are backwards.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting, creepy visual touch to the...
If I see a horse with the hooves backwards, I'm running, bro. That is some uncanny valley shit right there, you know?
Yeah.
Also, another thing I wanted to mention is that they can also shapeshift. So they can also assume the form of humans, maidens, which is a reference to... I believe there's a lot of similarities between Kelpies and the Sirens. You know, same
absolutely.
idea of, you know, being lured into a body of water somehow. And I don't know where that came from. Was it probably just because, like, I don't know, sailors were so, like, dehydrated, they saw beautiful women.
No,
you know?
It's been long, like, hypothesized that the reason sailors would see mermaids and sirens and such would be from, you know, either being at sea too long and getting, you know, sunstroke, or just not having the right, you know, minerals while in their food and just going crazy over time. And so a lot of that has been theorized from a long time now, scientifically, to be the reason people would see stuff like the sirens, or they'd crash their ships because they saw, you know, a beautiful woman beckoning them.
Yeah.
If you're also walking around the Scottish lakes or anywhere similar, even in like continental Europe, and you're reading stuff that you shouldn't be, or you don't know is safe to eat, it's also possible that you're hallucinating, and then you create a whole narrative around it because a lot of people are doing the same thing.
Yeah. Another one cryptid in the UK that I like a lot and I wanted to touch on is the Cornish Owl Man. Now, this is a relatively new one, I believe, reported the first time in like 1976. And some people, I think it was teenagers, saw a humanoid-looking owl creature flying around a Cornish church in Mownan Smith. Is that how you say it? I never pronounce certain names of places in this country very well still. But yes, I like it because it actually draws parallel to one of my favorite cryptids in the US, and that is the Mothman of Point Pleasant in West Virginia.
Yes, Mothman.
And both of these creatures are described look-wise to be, you know, quite similar. That one obviously being more moth-like, and this one being an owl man. But I love that we have these similar but different ones, because you can see how the place where you are can affect it so much. Like here, we have a lot of owls, you know, barn owls specifically, and they love to make nests around our larger buildings like churches and monasteries. So of course, you know, if you're going to see something here flying around a monastery and mistake it for a creepy cryptid, it's probably going to be an owl. And that explains, you know, the entire way this myth has been built, and this cryptid now looks like this in all the sightings. Whereas in the US, you know, it looked different because there's different animals at play. So you see this thing where the nature in a place and the actual available animals can completely change the kind of creatures you end up having turned into these cryptids and myths, because who knows what actual living animal the people really saw to begin with.
That's right. And it's also a matter of suggestion, right? So your mind suggests a lot of things to you depending on what you're seeing at the time. If it's dark, then your mind is trying to fill in a lot of gaps. And the way you can do that is by imagining things that are not there. So maybe someone sees an owl on top of a tree and the outline surrounding it looks like someone in a suit or whatever. And they're like, oh, there's the owl man, rather. So, and then that's how these all things come about. I remember when I was younger, I said I'll bring this up at some point. My parents used to work late, so I used to be left home alone. And I would watch Most Haunted. Because I wasn't, I don't know why, I was 8 and I would watch Most Haunted. And it was the power of suggestion. Obviously there was nothing there, but it was a power of suggestion. Like maybe a moth would fly and they'll show it on their creepy 144 pixel camera. Oh, look, there's the orb of the ghost. And I'm like, yes, that's definitely the orb of the ghost. That's definitely not just some moth flying around. So I think it's also the power of suggestion. If someone tells you a thing exists, right? I remember when I was younger and mobile phones started to take off and, you know, these chat groups, and my parents would be sent pictures of like, oh, someone's found a mermaid washed up shore. And I'm like, yeah, that's definitely not a mermaid. But, you know, my parents, they don't know any better. Like, yeah, that's definitely a mermaid because somebody said it online. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I also think as a kid, I was a lot more into this. I had a book full of like English cryptids. Like, I used to love this stuff. I used to, crawl the internet looking for any kind of footage I could find about any sort of cryptid in the US, here, in Europe, anywhere else, really. Because as a kid, this was, it's such a world of wonder. It adds wonder to the really, well-established and somewhat boring understanding we have of the world at that point. Because you're a kid and you don't like the idea that so much has already been discovered and so much is already found and there's so little magic and myth to it left, right? So of course you're going to gravitate to stuff like this. You're going to look into it and you're going to be like, that'd be so cool. Yeah, of course there's going to be, the Loch Ness Monster or Kelpies or anything like that. Because it's so much more fascinating.
Are we saying that Mothman is in the US because there's tons of moths, and Owlman is here because we have tons of owls?
No, I'm saying Owlman is here because we have very common owl sightings, usually. I'm saying Mothman's in the US because they have way more giant bird-sized creatures that it could have been. Yeah. So who knows what it could have been. There they have vultures, eagles, bald-neck vultures, so much that it could have been instead. But that's what I mean here, because how many real big birds do we have in the UK? Owls, and that's about it. We have hawks and a few eagles, but none of them are, massive or hard to really look at and be like, oh, that's a mythical creature. Whereas owls, when you see one in the dark and their eyes glow in the dark and they seem very, big and hunched
supernatural
over under all the fluff. Exactly, yeah. It's way easier to see here why when someone saw an owl flying around a church spire, they were like, oh God, it's the Owl Man.
I like your premise about how the environment influences local cryptids and stuff like that, because I wanted to bring up, if you guys are happy to move on real quick, I wanted to bring up Jack Frost.
Jack Frost.
Yes, I love Jack Frost.
We all know about Jack Frost. We've heard of Jack Frost. We might have watched the animation or the cartoons when we were younger.
Oh, he's been in a lot of media now.
That's right, exactly. And I like the idea that Jack Frost is the personification of winter, of the freezing cold, right? And in today's pop culture, that might remind us of The Night King, for example. But Jack Frost is supposed to be this devilish...
Here we go again.
This devilish mischief maker character, or maybe perhaps even sometimes the hero, right? I mean, if you remember the old cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about Jack Frost, and perhaps where it came from?
One of my favorite interpretations of Jack Frost actually comes from the film Rise of the Guardians, which, in my opinion, should have gotten a huge sequel later on, because it was basically a team-up of a lot of cryptids. You had...
Is that the Owl movie?
No, that's Guardians of the Gahoo. That's a different film, but this was kind of like an Avengers team-up. Like, you had Santa Claus teaming up with Jack Frost, and they teamed up with the Sandman, and they were all just going around just fighting stuff. But yeah, Jack Frost is an amazing myth, and as Joe mentions, he seems to be almost like a bit of a trickster character.
Because he brings the winter, right? With Jack Frost comes the cold, the freezing, and the winter, and it might be associated with this old either Anglo-Saxon or Norse idea of winter deities, for example, or just generally any winter deity, even in Greek mythology.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Demeter when we talked about Greek mythology, So yeah, I was going to say, to me, it seems like the obvious, evolution of just having winter itself, or the seasons associated with different entities, different deities. So yeah, Jack Frost seems like a more modern take, because we don't really have, gods of seasons anymore. So you have to come up with something new. So a cryptid like Jack Frost makes perfect sense to suddenly apply to where Demeter used to be as the incoming winter and the scary cold.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also want to break from the topic of Jack Frost. This one is for Joe. We also have a lot of ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we have ghosts everywhere.
Yeah, but, we have... You mentioned how the Owl Man was seen originally in a monastery, right? And I think, we have a lot of stuff like that in monasteries. And I'm actually going to ask this question to Joe. Joe, have you heard of this monk called Benedict?
Which one? Do you mean Saint Benedict?
I mean the ghost Benedict that's apparently haunting Westminster Abbey.
No, I've not heard of Ghost Benedict
so
before.
Apparently Westminster Abbey has its own little cryptid in the form of monk Benedictus, and he is he's apparently lives at the top floor, and this is on account of a friend who actually went there and apparently saw a monk just show up at the top of Westminster Abbey, as the tour guide was saying how no one uses the top floor anymore or something like that. But yeah, that's one of the local London kind of ooh, Westminster Abbey is haunted by the ghost of a monk, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up ghosts, because I do personally, I don't consider them cryptids.
No.
In the sense that ghosts are such a universal, like, almost part of a lot of people's belief systems. A lot of people, if you believe in the afterlife, you also believe in ghosts and spirits. So they're almost not the same thing at this point, especially because we have sightings of them, tenfold, hundreds of more times than any other cryptid. They're not really, they're not specific cryptids. Ghosts are just ghosts. It's always associated with the spirit of a certain person that supposedly lived or passed away in a certain spot or not. So to me, ghosts are a lot more a different side of modern mythology than cryptids. Cryptids to me have always been when it's a named, known entity, that can be almost described and visualized, whereas ghosts, they come in so many shapes and forms and sizes. We have the classical, that's been made famous now, version of ghosts here, where it's, Victorian era looking, dressed. There's the ones in Japan, which a lot of their horror has made great use of the imagery of, the ghosts look really terrifying, because in Japan, a ghost that isn't happy after its death is usually left looking the exact way it looked at its moment of death, or in the state that its corpse was left in. Yeah. So you have this way more horrifying version of ghosts there, where you have, the long hair over their faces and bones contorting in odd ways, and it's just, ghosts are their own, to me, topic almost when you look at cryptids and then ghosts as a whole, if that makes sense. Yeah, but
they share a lot of similarities with some of them. For example, like you have one of my favorites idea of, like, it's a mixture of both a ghost and a cryptid almost. The brownie, also known as the silky, I believe. That's something of like a British kind of like cryptid, because it's a spirit, but also it's a helpful spirit, like it's a helpful night spirit that like apparently does the chores for you at night. I fucking wish, please. But something like that, it's like, where do you draw the line? Like, obviously you have the idea of like ghosts being like, oh yeah, ghosts are haunting and stuff, but like they can also be helpful spirits, like Silky or a pixie, for example. Do you count the pixie as a ghost? I don't know, like. So
the Silky is the opposite of a poltergeist, I guess?
I guess so. Yeah, you can say that. I guess you can say that.
Interesting.
But again, where do you draw the line? Because there's obviously
to me, it's the fact that when you think a pixie or a fae or a fairy, you think a specific species of ghost.
Yeah.
You're thinking a specific creature. You can visualize it. When you think ghost, just ghost, you have a billion different versions, a billion different sightings. It's too broad for me to put it as a cryptid, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Even the church is ambivalent on it, because they won't directly outright reject the existence of ghosts, but they won't also say that they're there. They just say that if people say there are ghosts, then there probably are things that people accept as ghosts. And I guess I assume actually that a lot of us might have had dreams about our loved ones who may have passed away, and sometimes we may associate that with their soul, right? So we're talking about the soul here. But at the same time, the church very well accepts that there are such things as incubus and succubus. So
oh lords, don't get me started on those, please. I absolutely despise
before
them.
we move on from ghosts, I was going to ask, do any of you have like sightings or paranormal things you've had experienced during your like younger years or up till now?
Yes, I have.
I actually have nothing.
Should I go ahead?
Go on, Jeff.
So it must have started like, it wasn't exactly the scene in Constantine where baby Constantine sees that scary ghost lady on the bus. But I was young and I was in my grandmother's house and I was just playing in the living room. She was babysitting me, so she was in the garden. She was tending to her flowers. She loved her flowers. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I was just playing, and then I saw what I thought was someone walking past me, like in full uniform. It was like a military garb, and then it was because I was small. I was maybe 5 years old, so I was short. But I could tell that it was as if someone was walking past me and paying no attention to me. And I was like, what the heck was that? And then, so I went to tell my grandmother, and then she was a bit spooked about it. So she told my mum, and then my mum was like, well, give me more details. Explain to me what you saw. And I said, well, it looked like he was wearing trousers and so on. It was like in a navy uniform, and he had something on his head. Now, I didn't know back then what like a crown or a hat was or anything. Mm-hmm. So she was like, well, the description you've given sounds like very similar to this particular commander who was very famous at that point in this area. And I was like, what? and then that was the most vivid example I remember. But there have been other instances throughout my childhood where I've seen things and then I had to take a double take. Or if there was anyone with me, I would ask him, did you just see that thing over there? And they were like, what thing? Are you okay? Are you on something? And I'm like, no, I'm definitely not on anything.
Yeah, I have a few spooky ghost story experiences as well, personally. So the place I grew up in when I was very young in Romania, we were on a piece of land where it was our house, and then there were two other old, dilapidated, almost 200-year-old, I think, houses. And those two houses were too dangerous to go in, right? They were falling apart, even though me and my friends would all the time go in because we're idiots at that age. But they were falling apart, they were old, rotting, creepy little houses. Every now and then, though, when me and my friends would play around them or inside them, we'd see... not exactly ghost sightings where it's like, oh, I literally saw a ghost. You'd see shadows of grown people, around corners. You'd hear noises, and we always put it down to this houses. These houses were ancient. They were about to literally fall out under us when we'd go exploring in them. So we always put it down to, it can be explained away what we were seeing, but it was always really creepy. And when I was alone, I would never go near these houses. They've been demolished now, so I never can. But back then, when I was a kid, yeah, these freaked me out, because every now and then I'd be like in my house, I'd look out the window, I'd look through the window of one of these houses, and you'd see the shape of a person, for example. You'd see things moving about, and that could just be the wind, because the houses were so dilapidated that wind could pass through them. There were holes in them and stuff. But it was always off-putting, and as a child, I always sat there, looked at it, wondered, what is that? Is that something, a ghost? Did I just see something really creepy? And I always avoided them as a result.
Lauren's going to old houses like, hey, demons, it's me, your boy.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that about wraps it up. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this episode on Cryptids. We hope you're enjoying it so far. Tune in next week for part 2. Don't forget Cousin Randy. Cousin Randy is important.
Oh, send us to everyone, your friends, family, your third cousin 5 times removed, Randy, that you haven't spoken to since you were born. I'm sure he'll know who you are. And I gotta say thank you to these guys, because this is coming out weeks after when we're recording it, but I'm on a really tight schedule for several reasons this week, and so are Lawrence and Ivaylo, but they were so accommodating to recording now. All right, it's been Joe.
It's been Ivaylo.
And Lawrence.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.